BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Friday, another Cooper Friday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Fridays I talk to you guys about D.B. Cooper, the man responsible for the only unsolved skyjacking in U.S. aviation history. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about D.B. Cooper. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Box Ned. On November 24th of 1971, a man using the name Dan Cooper boarded a plane going from Portland to Seattle. While he was on board the plane, he handed a note to a flight attendant stating that he had a bomb in his briefcase, and he opened it and displayed what appeared to have been a bomb. Then he took everybody on the plane hostage and demanded $200,000 and 4 parachutes. He successfully obtained these in Seattle, and then instructed the pilots to fly to Mexico. When they informed him that the plane didn't have enough fuel to fly to Mexico, they agreed upon Reno, Nevada. But Cooper didn't need that much time. At some place over the Pacific Northwest, D.B. Cooper jumped out and parachuted into the night, never to be seen or heard from again, to everyone's satisfaction, although of course some people claim that they've identified D.B. Cooper. And that's really what I would like to do in this episode right now. I want to talk to you guys about how can we solve the D.B. Cooper case. And one of the points that people bring up from time to time is the DNA evidence. There was a lot of evidence that was left behind. We're talking about things that D.B. Cooper touched and handled on the plane, most notably the cups where he was drinking his bourbon and soda from. He smoked cigarettes on the plane, Raleigh filter-tip cigarettes. He left behind a palm print on an armrest, and also a hair slide was lost by the FBI. When D.B. Cooper put his head against the headrest, he left behind a hair. But I really want to talk about the evidence that was obtained from D.B. Cooper's tie, because everybody zones in on the metallic particles that were left behind. D.B. Cooper wore a black clip-on tie with a mother-of-pearl tie clip, but he did not take it with him when he jumped out of the plane. The tie was left behind, and some people think that the evidence that was left behind on the tie will bring us to Cooper. But in most discussions, they look at how when D.B. Cooper's tie was put under the electron microscope, they found all types of particles, such as titanium, such as uranium, thorium, antimony, all types of things that were even combined with other ones like titanium, antimony, as well as perhaps titanium and aluminum. So there were more than 100,000 microparticles that were found on D.B. Cooper's tie when it was placed under the microscope. But that's not exactly the focus of this particular episode, because I want to look at what some of the news coverage is saying about D.B. Cooper's DNA. I want to look at an article that was written by the Daily Mail. This is from Stephen M. Lepore, just citing the source, and it says, "New analysis of D.B. Cooper's DNA will be so specific that it will determine if hijacker has kids or a dog," says investigator, who finally got a hold of an adequate testing device. And that's a very big claim. So let's see how this measures up. A sleuth investigating the D.B. Cooper case who has acquired a sample of the missing skyjacker's DNA says the analysis will be so specific that it can determine if he had children or even a dog. A man whose identity is unknown hijacked a Boeing 727 at Seattle-Tacoma Airport on November 24, 1971, and held its crew and passengers hostage with a bomb threat. Once his demand of $200,000 in cash, the equivalent of $1.2 million today, was reached and transferred onto the plane, he had the crew take off before he parachuted out over the Pacific Northwest. The compelling case is the only unsolved skyjacking in U.S. aviation history. But citizen investigator Eric Ulus believes that an engineer named Vince Peterson from Pittsburgh was the man behind it. Well, this isn't so much about the DNA right now, but I do have a standalone episode on Vince Peterson as a D.B. Cooper suspect, and I'm not overly convinced that Vince Peterson was D.B. Cooper. Eric Ulus sued the FBI last year to gain access to D.B. Cooper's tie, which he believes contains crucial evidence, but the case was dismissed in December. Peterson's daughter, Julie Dunbar, has now joined in for calls to have the information released. And the only obstacle stopping us from solving this case is the FBI, said Eric Ulus, and he has been trying to solve the case for over a decade and says that he's finally obtained a DNA sample via a scientist who tested the tie left behind by D.B. Cooper with a device to find traces of various metals, chemicals, and pollen. And as I understand, pollen testing is called palynology. It's spelled Palyn, palynology. And this is one of the strongest substances in the world. I was told that the strongest substance in the world, the strongest item in the world, is a diamond, and the second one is the pollen crystallis. So when they do palynological testing, they're trying to find out where somebody has been. They can determine which parts of the country that somebody has been in. They can also determine if certain pollen samples can be connected to other pollen samples. It actually is a very, very strong substance. Now, we're going to be hearing more about Eric Ulus, Tom Kay. The device scientists Tom Kay and Eric Ulus realized can capture the DNA, and they say that the samples contain D.B. Cooper's DNA with 100% certainty. Now, that's a big claim. Kay and Ulus believe that once a lab separates the DNA strands from a tie, they can build Cooper's genetic profile and compare it to those suspected of the skyjacking. Metagenomic DNA can separate individually all of the DNA profiles on the tie, even for something like a dog. So if D.B. Cooper had a dog, we'll be able to find that on there, Eric Ulus said. So you see, this Daily Mail article is very misleading. They just meant that, all right, it's possible to differentiate between human DNA and dog DNA, but we already knew that. It sounds like by conducting new analysis, they might be able to learn more. I'm just going to jump in right now and say that some of the concerns that people have about D.B. Cooper's DNA is that it may have been contaminated. And I talk about other true crime cases here on Black Box Online Radio, such as the Zodiac Killer and Jack the Ripper. And in those situations, the DNA evidence is horribly unreliable. I mean, we're talking about X amount of people could have contaminated the DNA that's being tested. It might not even be the suspect's DNA. So with D.B. Cooper, I wouldn't be overly surprised because D.B. Cooper committed the skyjacking in 1971, and the authorities would not have been aware of DNA. That stuff didn't come out until decades later. I mean, there was DNA involved in the 1980s, but not in 1971. So with these types of analyses, we always have to wonder if somebody else had handled the tie, somebody else had touched the tie, somebody else had left behind the DNA samples that were present. Let's continue with the Daily Mail article. Eric Ulus also believes that it would bear out if Cooper had any children. It's critically important because, let's say you have a dozen different DNA profiles on the tie from everyone that came into contact with it over the years, including various FBI agents and Cooper himself. Eric Ulus believes that the case could be solved by the end of the year. Well, this article was written in January of 2024. More than 12 months have gone by? No, not exactly. Because, I just told you guys, the DNA evidence in these decades-old mysteries is often horribly unreliable. And it's not like I want to keep the case open or anything. I want to know who D.B. Cooper is, and if you've listened this far into the episode, you want to know who D.B. Cooper is. I'm just giving you the honest statement that the DNA evidence is most likely questionable, and it's not always going to be the perfect answer to everything, because in some cases there's an enormous amount of DNA that's left behind. Say, for example, we've had the solving of the Golden State Killer mystery, we've had the Long Island serial killer arrested, and even Brian Kohberger and the Idaho 4 murders. Well, in the first two examples that I just listed off, there was a very large amount of DNA that could be connected to multiple crime scenes in both the Golden State Killer and the Long Island serial killer case, and we're talking about semen and saliva, and then also touch DNA. And with the Brian Kohberger case, the touch DNA was actually rather well preserved, and very shortly after the murder took place, Brian Kohberger was arrested. So that's not the case at all with D.B. Cooper. We're talking about decades after Cooper committed the skyjacking. Now they're going to go back and try and do DNA testing. It's not impossible. And I don't want to sound like a pure pessimist. It's possible. I mean, they might be able to do this, but I am approaching this with a certain amount of skepticism and a certain amount of doubt. I'm certainly not going to say, oh, well, the D.B. Cooper case could be solved by the end of the year, because maybe that's not the case. And here's a quotation. We're going to have figured out who this guy is, and we're going to have a solid DNA profile to work with. And the family of a lead suspect in the D.B. Cooper case has previously called for the FBI to release crucial tie evidence that could solve the case in just 10 minutes. No, I don't really think they can solve the case in just 10 minutes, but microscopic evidence from the tie was obtained in 2013 and pointed toward rare specialty metals from the aerospace sector. I've talked about this so many times on Black Box Online Radio when I've said that the metals on the tie are not going to be the pathway to D.B. Cooper. Maybe we can use something else, but that's not going to be the perfect way to solve the case. Eric Ulus traced these back to a defunct specialty facility in Pittsburgh called Crucible Steel. And that's going to go on for a while, talking about the particles on D.B. Cooper's tie. But let's look here, though, at some other statements, because, of course, Eric Ulus is going to try and connect this to a suspect named Vince Peterson, but as I understand, in the recent months, he has not exactly abandoned Vince Peterson. It's just that he has analyzed the particles on D.B. Cooper's tie that also contain uranium and thorium, and he said that Vince Peterson did not work with them, so he's starting to veer away. And I wanted to use this episode as an opportunity to talk about the media and how they're responding to the news coverage surrounding D.B. Cooper's DNA. And there's an article from the U.S. Sun that says, DNA unearthed. Pressure piles on the FBI to act now and identify the skyjacker to solve the mystery. An investigator leading the charge to finally unmask D.B. Cooper has penned an open letter to the FBI seeking fresh DNA tests to help solve the decades-old mystery as a new potential suspect has entered the fray. So we have some statements here that it seems like the FBI actually does have a lot of evidence that they aren't releasing. And as I was messing around on the internet earlier today, I saw a post from Quora, a wonderful place to get your news, but it stated that they did indeed extract D.B. Cooper's DNA back in 2016. This would be well after a lot of the DNA tests that were done in the earlier part of that decade, even all the way back until 2007. Now, I have a standalone episode on the D.B. Cooper suspect Sheridan Peterson, and some people think that he was just purely eliminated because of DNA analysis. His DNA did not match. But, as I just told you, it seems like there might be a stronger DNA sample that was obtained in 2016. And those tests were done years before. Now, does that mean that Sheridan Peterson was D.B. Cooper? Not necessarily. But it means that the DNA tests that were done prior to 2016 might be questionable. And this also goes to show that they make advancements in science all the time. They're called scientific developments. At one time, they might think that they have the right sample, and they have to say, wait a second, this might be a contaminant. Now we have a stronger sample. And there are also different ways to analyze DNA. There's nuclear DNA and mitochondrial DNA. But let's just have a read here from this article from The Sun, just citing the source. Dan D.B. Cooper was the alias of an individual who hijacked a commercial Boeing 727 on Thanksgiving Eve 1971 over Portland and held the plane for a $200,000 ransom and parachuted out of the plane with his bounty, never to be seen again. Eric Ulus has identified Vince Peterson as his primary suspect after discovering dozens of titanium particles on the tie that were traced back to Crucible Steel. Well, this is not exactly the stuff that I want to hear. So we're going to jump ahead right now to there's a sample of the thief's DNA. Believing that he's taken his investigation into Peterson as far as he possibly can without the FBI's assistance, Eric Ulus is asking for a Hail Mary, and scientific analysis of the tie by the world-renowned McCrone Labs appears to indicate that D.B. Cooper frequented and maybe even worked at Crucible Steel in the 1960s. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't, because D.B. Cooper could have obtained the tie in countless ways. What if he borrowed it from Joe Schmo who worked at Crucible Steel? What if he stole it? What if he got it at a thrift shop? What if he found it in the garbage? So many things. But the DNA, though, would be obtained from, let's say, for example, D.B. Cooper definitely handled the tie because he was wearing it. He most likely also handled the tie clip. And touch DNA can be left behind, it can be preserved, even if many years go by. This means that this could be at a time when D.B. Cooper would have been able to have left behind some evidence that actually could lead to his identity. But you guys know this just as well as I do. Back in 1971, people would handle things with their bare hands. Detectives and investigators in the FBI would touch things without gloves on them. If they thought they couldn't obtain fingerprints from them, they didn't know that you had to completely preserve the evidence like that. And this happened very clearly in the Zodiac Killer case, when the detectives handled the bindings from Lake Berryessa with bare hands. So the DNA evidence is just null and void, it's ruined or contaminated. And this is something that is just a little bit disappointing. It's extremely disappointing, but they didn't know that DNA technology was going to come onto the scene. Back to the Sun article. They have Cooper's DNA, said Eric Ulus. It's on CODIS, and I either need to be able to access that, or they need to take what I have and do what they need to do for comparison purposes. At this point, the evidence in my mind points to only two possible people, and there's so much that I can do. Well, this is a very hard statement, though. If they have D.B. Cooper's DNA, and they want to put it into CODIS, I mean, people are just going to be lining up and trying to do what Eric Ulus is going to be doing. Over 900 confessions, allegedly, reportedly, about D.B. Cooper, about being D.B. Cooper. People have confessed to have been D.B. Cooper. They've claimed to have identified D.B. Cooper. So ultimately, that's where everything stands right now. And I think that that's just going to be another complication. I'm bumping against the wall here, said Eric Ulus. I feel like I've got 90% of the way, but in terms of actually determining 100% who D.B. Cooper was, he could have been, at this point, that's going to be up to the FBI. We've done an enormous amount of work as private citizens over the last several years, finding out a lot of new information that the FBI never did. To use a football analogy, they've got the ball to the 5-yard line. We just need the FBI to be willing to punch it over the goal line with a small push. Well, again, I don't really know how much the FBI is going to cooperate with that, but if they do have a solid sample of D.B. Cooper's DNA, and I'm not convinced that they do, but if they do have a solid sample, that would be just monumental for this case. Now, there's an article that came out a few months ago, actually. This is one of the newer articles, and it's from PR.com, when it says, DNA expert to discuss solving the D.B. Cooper case. And this was released on PR.com. A renowned United States forensic genealogist whose expertise helped solve the Somerton Man mystery and identify passenger remains from the Titanic says that these investigations are like doing a Sudoku puzzle. She will be in Seattle and be a featured speaker at CooperCon. Colleen Fitzpatrick was a pioneer who has worked on numerous John Doe and Jane Doe cases, and she first heard of the Somerton Man in 2013 and met up with Adelaide University researcher Derek Abbott in 2014. The pair worked together to identify a man who was found slumped in Adelaide, Australia. But here are some more things, though, about the D.B. Cooper case. She now turns her attention to the only unsolved hijacking in U.S. aviation history, when a man calling himself Dan Cooper demanded parachutes and $200,000 on a flight from Portland to Seattle on Thanksgiving Eve in 1971. Cooper is believed to have jumped from the aft stairway, a rare feature that belonged to the Boeing 727 somewhere just north of Portland, after the plane left Seattle destined for Reno. The cigarette butts that the FBI collected from where Cooper was seated were unfortunately destroyed after fingerprint testing and brand analysis back in 1971 and 72 were not present. When DNA analysis did not identify criminals that did exist, they used another method. Okay, this means something very important. Let's say they do have D.B. Cooper's DNA. It's put into the CODIS system, and it's not any known criminal who has been arrested. But this is an important issue because I'm not surprised. Are you surprised about that? Can I just throw that to you as a challenge question? Are you actually surprised about that D.B. Cooper's DNA was not found in the CODIS system? If that actually is his DNA and not a contaminant? Because I'm not convinced that D.B. Cooper was arrested for any other major crime, or that D.B. Cooper's DNA would be found in the CODIS system. I mean, how do we know that D.B. Cooper would have his DNA taken by the authorities? The FBI possesses a clip-on tie believed to have been worn and left by Cooper on the seat where he sat on the flight, while they identified a partial DNA sample Over a decade ago, they have not allowed the tie to be tested with the latest techniques employed by the ones like Dr. Fitzpatrick uses. A hair was taken from the back of the seat where Cooper sat, and the slide was tagged in evidence, but the FBI has since misplaced it. Cooper also cut shroud lines and checked the packing cards on the parachutes that remained on the plane. And that really is the end of this post here from PR.com, but I do have to give credit to Pat Boland. I talk about this very frequently here on Cooper Friday, and she's the one who said that one of the easiest ways, okay, not the easiest, but one possible way to identify D.B. Cooper would be that when D.B. Cooper received the 4 parachutes, he touched the packing cards on the one that he did not use, and the packing card may actually have his touch DNA. So I have to give credit to her because that's her observation. But as far as D.B. Cooper's DNA goes, this is something that I'm not the most optimistic about because, if they have it, great. If they've actually entered it into the CODIS system, even better. But I have doubts, only because I've explored other true crime cases and found that the DNA evidence is not always reliable. They think that it's the perpetrator's DNA, and then it turns out that it was left by a completely different individual. I wanted to use this as an opportunity to talk about some of the media coverage surrounding D.B. Cooper's DNA, and there's an article from Newswest 9 that says, investigators extract DNA from necktie of infamous hijacker D.B. Cooper. And as you're going to see, as you've seen throughout the entirety of this episode, the DNA is only coming from the tie. They don't have the hair slide, they don't have the cigarettes, they don't have the glasses or cups that he touched. I should just call them the cups as opposed to glasses, but they just don't have that. And it says, the FBI confirms that it has been able to develop a DNA sample from evidence collected from D.B. Cooper's tie in 2001. And this article was written by Chris Ingalls, just citing the source. They say the tie and the tie clasp that was also recovered from the plane are not just part of Cooper nostalgia. They are perhaps the most powerful pieces of evidence during the 36 years of investigation. The FBI confirms that it was able to develop a DNA sample from evidence collected from the tie in 2001. Any body fluid, skin cells, and we shed skin cells, said Larry Carr nonstop. So, I guess Larry Carr's weighed in on that, but, this is a little bit older news, and it was just maybe not the most beneficial discussion. But I also told you guys that I don't want to appear as a pure pessimist. I would think that some way, somehow, they would be able to obtain D.B. Cooper's DNA. And I did a recent live stream here on Black Box Online Radio, and Ryan Burns appeared in the chat, Ryan Burns of the D.B. Cooper Sleuth channel, and he stated that the best way to solve the case would be if they some way, somehow find the hair slide in FBI evidence. But we just have to pray that that happens. As far as the tie goes, I'm really just not convinced that they have reliable DNA evidence. Even if there is news coverage saying that they have a strong DNA profile in 2016, or they even have made advancements in 2024, I'm not convinced of that. But I will just ask you, do you believe that they have D.B. Cooper's DNA? Or do you believe that it's all a bunch of confusion? And I don't really mean that anyone's doing anything malicious. When I've expressed my doubts, I'm just stating that when I say things like contaminants, that's confusion. They think that they're testing D.B. Cooper's DNA, but in all reality, it could be someone different altogether. I would love to know what you think. Anybody can write the show at blackboxonlineradio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is under the name of Ned DeHaan, but there's a Black Box Online Radio Facebook page. And of course, BlackBoxNed88 on TikTok and Instagram. And I'll see you over there. Until next time.